Hi everyone. This is part 2 to the lecture on sexual selection. So there was part 1, now we're gonna start part 2. So we ended on slide 30. So we're gonna start this one, we're gonna pick up on slide 31. But before I do that, I actually wanna talk about the discussion prompts. So I'm recording this before that prompt is due, so I know not everyone has commented yet on that. You still have a few days, because I always record these a little early before I post them. But I did notice that some of you have started. That's great. And if you had forgotten, hopefully this is a good reminder. So like I said before, you have to do, I think I have it set up, you do 3 during the whole semester, and this counts as your like participation. But also it gives me the opportunity, and this is what I want to do right now with you, is gives me the opportunity to be able to use some of your comments, and I can kind of incorporate that into what I'm discussing with you in these PowerPoint lectures. Obviously, I'm not going to use your guys' names. I don't want to call anyone out. But some of you have, pretty much everyone actually has some really great comments, and I want to incorporate those into what I'm talking about. And actually, as a side note, I'll tell you, because I had a couple students email me, don't worry about having the like perfect or correct answer to any of the prompts. Some of them have a little more of a correct answer than others, but they are a discussion. I want you to be able to discuss these. I'm leaving some of them, like maybe part A or part B or something, you know, a little more open-ended. I'm expecting you guys to kind of pull in. I want to hear your thoughts on this. I mean, obviously informed by what we've talked about in the class and on these lectures, but you know, I'm expecting there to be different answers, and I'm hoping there will be, and I'm hoping we'll even have, you know, some interesting back and forth, maybe even some disagreements. And this is, I think I mentioned this to you guys before, but I want to point this out again, that especially in science and in academia, it is so vital that we have informed discussion. And I've heard this a lot recently, like, what, you know, this is true whether we're talking about, you know, science or academia or like your personal lives and other issues or topics, that you know, certain things are just not up for debate. And while I get the sentiment behind that, like as a scientist, it like sticks wrong in my ear, and I think, but like that's wrong, that's bad, that's not a good policy for a few reasons. Like, one is, and this is true for anything in your life, you might think that you have the right opinion about something, and you might be correct in that, but you might not be. And being able to have that informed debate or discussion with someone, whether it's like just a friend or like in a class setting, you know, informal versus more formal, that being able to have that discussion or dialogue with someone is really important. You might end up changing their mind about something you feel very strongly about, or you might realize that you were incorrect in your thought process on something, and someone now can present evidence to you that can change your mind. This is really important. I think so many people, I should say so many, a lot of people lack this ability, and it's such a good ability as a person in the world, is being able to change your opinion or view or stance on something when presented with evidence. That is what we do in science all the time. That's what science is, right? We're building on, changing, adapting because of new information. I talked about this before with one of those, what am I blanking? One of those 3 main ways that science remains objective: repeatable, falsifiable, and then changes with new evidence. So this is really important. So anyway, relating that to the discussions, I would encourage, I hope, and I would even encourage there to be a little back and forth about some of these topics, that if you disagree, that's totally fine. You might have an unpopular opinion, that is totally fine. Do not be afraid to comment on that, and I would encourage you to do so. Obviously, I've put this in the syllabus, everyone needs to be respectful on those discussion boards, but I will tell you right now that in life, you know, everyone, and I too, also have very unpopular opinions about certain things, and that's fine, you know. And then of course I feel like some of my opinions are very like mainstream, so like that, but that's probably everyone, right? The point is, you should never be afraid to voice your concerns or bring up a slightly different view, or maybe even opposite view on something, especially on these discussion boards. You know, you might feel one way, and I saw a little bit of that when I was looking. And I don't know if this is because this is the first assignment for this, that it seemed as if some of the replies, people were being very respectful, don't get me wrong, but it seemed as if there was a little bit of hesitation to disagree, And I get that, and I'm like, that's fine. But I'm hoping that that might shift a little bit as we go through, finish up this one, and then go into the next one or the next one. So anyway, so the point of that is, like I said, don't be afraid of giving me the wrong answer. These are open-ended for a very specific reason, and like 95% of the time, you're not going to give me a wrong answer. Like, don't BS the questions. Like, I guess technically there could be a wrong answer, but the point is, like I said, that they're a little more open-ended because I want to see some discussion. I want to see your thoughts on some of this, and okay. Anyway. So I'm looking down. I made a few notes on what some of you had commented. So like I said, not everyone has commented because it's still open, at least at the time of this recording. But a few people have commented on a few things that I just wanted to touch on. One second. So the first thing is, quite a few people had commented about men, in terms of like attracting a potential mate, indicating that they are physically fit in some way. And a few people mentioned this in terms of like on dating apps, that their picture might be, them flexing their muscles or without a shirt on to, make it look like they're very strong, which like evolutionarily, like when we were talking about it, could be, indicator to the female that they're going to be a good protector, that they have good genes in terms of like maybe like they're very healthy or have a good immune system. So like those are accurate. Those are good comments. And a few people had commented on things like social media in general, but also like dating apps. And I kind of want to get into this. It's unfortunate that we don't have this in class. What's the word? Interaction, and I'm hoping to kind of, like I said, use the discussion boards and incorporate that into the PowerPoint, like in this way that I'm doing now, to kind of facilitate that. But it's just not the same, because usually we start talking about this and like every student has a question or a comment or a story, and it can just be kind of fun, but it's totally informative, and we end up having a really great class time because of it, and we all learn something because of it. So we don't get to have that. So I'm going to try to incorporate that. So hopefully, like I said, the discussion board's still open. Hopefully everyone continues to comment and we get even more information. This is going to be really cool. But from what people have commented so far on the stuff about social media and dating apps, let me see. Oh, so like someone had commented that we don't see a lot of more of this like meeting in person, kind of having a more of like that natural meeting for like a romantic partner, that a lot of it's online, and that's true. So like that's interesting from a very cultural perspective, looking at how technology has changed these why am I blanking on words today? Has changed like these romantic or sexual interactions between people because of technology. That's like super interesting from a cultural perspective, but also evolutionarily it's really interesting too, because like I said before, you only have like 3 or 4 seconds of someone's, like on some of these dating apps, let's say, a few seconds of someone's time to catch their attention, whether you're male or female, looking for a male or a female. You only have a moment, and usually it's in that first picture. And there might be some words, depending on, some of these apps are more complex than others. Some are more intricate in terms of like the information that you give or can get out of them. That's true. But for the most part, you're still only getting, a few moments of someone's time to catch their attention. And of course you want to put your, the best picture of you up. And that's going to be different versus whether you're a male or a female. So we talked about this in the PowerPoint on part 1, with even the angle of selfies, that there's totally an evolutionary reason why we do that as a male or a female, that the angles are important. We don't really think of it that way. We think, I just know I look better at this angle. We don't necessarily like pick it apart, but it's true. So there are other things too. Like if you only had, like a picture, what is the information you want to portray in that picture? And on top of that, is that information true or not true? And this is really important too, that we have the ability, I think, to lie, more easily. I mean, that's true for all social media, but especially on dating apps, you have the ability to lie more easily than when you meet someone in like real life, at least in that first impression. Someone, you could be standing next to a fancy car that you just saw in the parking lot, and people seeing your profile might be thinking, oh, that person like must be really wealthy, or they have really good taste, or I have that same car, we would get along, whatever it is. And we have the ability as males and females, it doesn't matter. Like, we have the ability to lie. But also, I would say, kind of on the reverse or the other end of the spectrum of that, we also have the ability to showcase who we are and highlight the things about us that we feel are the most important. Obviously, still, if you're on a dating app, still with the motive to capture someone's attention, you know. I feel like I just went on, I was just rambling and I didn't make a point, but you guys get what I'm saying. Okay, let me see. So the next thing, so some people put that people might have, or males might have in their profile, and to some degree showcasing that they might have money, and this could mean for a potential mate that they could offer, you know, security, and that's absolutely true. That I think while we tend to, and like this gets into some of the cultural stuff, that culturally I think we still have it as, well, you know, it's where I feel like we're in this like culture shifting in this, that it doesn't necessarily have to be like the male is the breadwinner of the home. But I feel like we still have the mentality to a degree. So I think in a lot of these apps, you still see that kind of infiltrating into these, you know, these profile pictures. Let's say, for example, that men probably tend to be more likely to indicate in some way that they have more money as a way of saying, I'm a good provider, I, you know, can offer security, and that's probably going to be less likely in the females. Now, they might state, I have a good job, you know, I'm a responsible adult in that sense, but the impact of that information is going to be different, I think, because of the cultural atmosphere that we still have. While I think it obviously is shifting a bit, but we still, I think, have that. And evolutionarily, this you know, touches on that a little bit too, that being a good provider might be something that a male might want to, information he might want to offer, versus the female. So I know the discussion post didn't talk about the females, because we'll talk about some of that later. But obviously the information that a female might put in her profile, or the picture she might put in her profile, might be different, because she's going to want to, I'm blanking on words today, she's going to want to indicate other things about her personality and her personal life. So anyway, the point of all this was, the discussion boards are going really well. You guys are really giving some great information. You're really touching on, I think, some personal experiences and some of the stuff we've talked about. So I'm just going to continue to work that into some of this. Someone else made a comment, and this was interesting, that, there was more than one person who kind of touched on this in direct or indirect ways, that the standards for men and women, I think someone commented that they had decreased and someone had commented that they'd increased. And I don't know, like, this is interesting. And this is one of those things I wish I could ask you guys as a class. What do you all think of that? You know, that, because I didn't put that in my question, but it's an interesting point. It got me thinking about it, that in terms of, because someone had related it to like social media and dating sites, that the standards are different, and like cultural implications for that, and evolutionarily, like, what does that mean? And it just got me thinking about it, like, have standards decreased or increased? So it's just kind of a thought. I'll keep thinking about it. Maybe I'll end up, you know, pulling it into this PowerPoint, but it was an interesting thought. Okay, so before I just keep rambling, because I could just probably ramble this for like an hour about this. Like I said, I have notes right here from the prompt, and you guys had some really good comments. But I think I'll leave the rest for now, and I'll try to incorporate them into this. Okay, so let's get to the PowerPoint. Okay, so slide 31, runaway sexual selection. So we have here, I'll just read this bullet point. Female preference for a particular trait and males evolving to compete for females reinforce each other, sometimes to disastrous consequences. So what I mean by this, and the peacock and the peahen is a really good example of this, is that sometimes, like, I think I mentioned this to you before when we talked about the forces of evolution. There are 5 forces, but for whatever reason, people love to focus in on natural selection. They like to have these very romantic stories about the environment and adaptation. Not everything is an adaptation. We talked about that before. Sometimes it could just be, you know, gene flow, genetic drift. And oftentimes it's sexual selection. It's not like functionally adaptive in some ways. We see a lot of these features in primates. Are like, what is that doing? How does that helping them? Maybe it's not helping them like chew their food or run faster. Maybe it's a sexual selective trait and this has happened, runaway sexual selection. So there might have been a reason at some point. So like this is a really good example. Like I said, what we know now from the research is that for peacocks, the feathers and the length, the coloring, all of that actually indicates things like health to the female. Like if the colors are more vibrant, usually like they're healthier. It also, like the brightness of the colors can also indicate, sorry, I have to like move my foot, can also indicate to the female like whether the male has more or fewer like insects on them, or it's a really good indicator of health. Now the females, because of like this evolutionary process, probably were selecting the brightest colors over and over again, and the males are obviously competing in this way, like the brightest colors, and suddenly you get over time, and like obviously like the feather length, you get over time something that looks like this, where now it's a very extreme, only because of sexual selection, it's become an extreme feature that actually might, I'll put an asterisk next to that, might be negative in some way for that male. Now, with those giant feathers, it's like nearly impossible for them to fly, especially if we're looking about like evolutionarily, like, you know, in when the tails were, oh my god, when the feathers were smaller, that and their ability to fly would have been, you know, obviously increased, and we see a decrease in that. So you might be thinking, wow, like how does that happen? You have like something that's probably really important to them as a species, being able to fly away from a predator, for example. And now we see that they don't really have the ability to do that, at least not to the same degree that they would have in the past. And it's still being selected for because of the sexual selection process. Give me 1 second. Waffle. 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 Stop that, please. Sorry, she's in the background. It's driving me crazy. Okay. Silly goose. Okay. What was I saying? Oh yeah, okay. So you might have this trait that has become, you know, extreme because of waffle. Waffle. Please stop it. Waffle. Oh goodness, now she's mad. I'm gonna turn away from you. Okay. Why would you let me lick myself? Okay. She's like, Mom. Interrupted again. Okay. Oh yeah. Let me back into my train of thought on this. So the feathers become so big because of this. So like you might be thinking like, how can this happen? You know, so go to the next slide 32. So costly signaling. These are kind of like two ideas kind of working in conjunction with each other to a bit. Oh my god. I'm not starting this video over. Oh. Get a grip, Alicia. Okay. Costly signaling. So, oh my gosh, Alicia. Okay. You might be thinking, I gotta start this. I lost my whole train of thought from the last 2 minutes of Waffles licking. Okay, so with these feathers, that they are, you know, large and now become a hindrance in some way, you might be thinking, how can this happen? Why doesn't natural selection as a process kind of, you know, adjust that and make it not that way? Because functionally now it's a problem, even though the females keep selecting it because they like it for whatever reason. You know, we know the reasons why, but they keep selecting it to this extreme. How can this be beneficial? It seems as if it's not. But then you take this other term, like I said on slide 32, costly signaling, where it actually can still sort of be adaptive in this way, that the males actually might be saying, look, now I have these big giant feathers that you, the females, have selected over time that indicate something important to you, but now it's this extreme feature that is now a detriment to me in other functional, really important ways. But what's also happening is he's also saying, but look, I'm still here. I'm still surviving. I can have this very exaggerated feature that should be a detriment to me, and I'm still able to survive, avoid predators with it. And so what he's saying is, what does that say about me to you now? And so the females were like, oh, you know, like, so think about it in terms of this way, like that even though a trait might seem as if it's not going to be beneficial in one aspect because of something very specific, and it makes sense, that it can still indicate something else important. And this is the whole point of costly signaling, that there's a cost associated with it, but it still might be indicating something else important about that individual as well. So now he's got these big feathers and the bright colors indicating health, and now also with this like handicap, he's indicating even with this problematic feature, I can still survive, and that just shows how resilient I am, how cunning I am, how smart, whatever it is, So think about it in terms of that way. Okay, slide 33. Okay, kind of switching up gears here a little bit. Sex and gender, this is so important. And we talk about this when I teach the cultural class too. Sex and gender are not the same thing. Sex and gender are not the same thing. Like, probably most of you know this, but unfortunately it's one of those terms that we see being used interchangeably all the time, and they're absolutely not the same thing. So we've talked about sex, male versus female. We talked about that humans are asexually, like other primates, like other mammals, a sexually reproducing species, males and females. You might on occasion have an outlier of that group, but we still have a binary in male and female. And in fact, I'm going to talk about this right now, sex and gender, but this will probably be the last time I talk about gender in this class. In the cultural class, we're going to talk about it a lot more kind of throughout the semester. So if you're in that class with me, you are aware of that. But in this class, we don't really talk about gender because this is a biological anthropology course. If we're talking about, forensic anthropology and digging up someone's bones, we don't know their gender. We can tell their sex. For males and females, we can typically tell it based on multiple features in the skeleton. We talked about that before, especially if you have the pelvis or the skull. You can tell whether you're looking at a male or female. But you can never know, and so refer to these bullet points right here under gender, like depending on how it's defined for you, depending on how we're defining it culturally, depending on how we're defining it academically. It can either be, how you view yourself culturally, or the perceptions and expectations that are put on you by society. So it could be that you have a way that, or oh my God, let me reword that. It's how you view yourself in terms of like your social, environment, your cultural environment, or kind of related to that, but a little different is what are the cultural or social expectations put on you because of your particular sex. So we see that they are definitely, they tend to be, what's the word? I want to say conjoined. Is that the word? Like, sex and gender. That typically what we see is, given your sex, there are certain like gendered roles that you might be expected to perform in some way. In any given society, they will be a little bit different. Or it could be your internal perception of how you view yourself socially. Either of those things, when you are just looking at bones, you have no way of knowing that information. Now, you might have other social or cultural context. Maybe you have a written record or some art or, some other things that might inform on that. But looking at just bones or looking at just, DNA, we can never know what's going on socially or culturally, especially like expectations, thoughts people have in their minds. We'll never know that information. It can only sometimes be informed by other evidence, but even then, we'll never really know, especially if it's like a very ancient group. But we can definitely tell, male versus female. So I want to make sure that this is clear. These are not the same thing at all. And we use them interchangeably, I think probably because, especially in the US, it probably started because as much like sex that we see everywhere, especially like in Las Vegas, it's still a taboo, I think, subject for us culturally and socially. And so when we see the word sex, like even though if we're talking about like, sex, male, female, we still are like, oh no. And so we're like, let's use the word gender. It's like a much more neutral or less offensive or whatever term in terms of like using that like like if you're filling out a form or something. And so we see that, but they're not the same thing. So I'll give you guys an example. As you can imagine, when I first got diagnosed with cancer, I was going to multiple doctor's appointments. And I felt like I filled out the same form like 100 times. And I remember being at my surgeon's office, and it's probably like the 10th time I filled out a medical form in like a week. And I was just like, oh my gosh. And so I'm filling out my information, my name, my address, insurance information. And they asked on the form, gender. And I remember thinking, like, they don't care. Like, my surgeon does not care how I view myself culturally. They don't care what expectations I feel are put on me by society because I'm a female. They want to know, what body parts do you have? They want to know my sex. They don't want to know my gender. And this is because we use those terms interchangeably, and they're not the same thing. And so I was really annoyed, and I crossed out gender and wrote sex. I'm like, you want to know my sex, that's what you want to know. But I get it that because we use them interchangeably, people aren't really informed on that. Just like we talked about before with using the term theory in everyday conversation versus using the term theory in science. They mean different things, but because we have the same term, they often get confused. And so, like, it makes sense why we do that and why people have that misunderstanding. But, it's like a pet peeve of mine. But there are times when you might want to talk about gender in a very specific way. Like, we're not talking about sex, we're talking about gender, or we're talking about both, or we're talking about, so it's important to be able to understand the distinction between the two. So for sex, so we're still on this slide 33. So sex, like I said, you can be categorized into biologically male or biologically female. We can base this on multiple things, and I think in a couple slides I talk about the ways that we can determine that. But I'll just say now, like, obviously we talked about this before with chromosomes, XX versus XY, the features of the body that happen during puberty that change, especially like in the areas of the hips and the skull, we see those major differences. The hormones, males versus females are going to be very different, especially at puberty and throughout life, that they're going to be very different in terms of like which ones, the amount. So we know that there are some clear, obvious differences based on multiple things. Okay, so slide 34. So I want to just make a point about this, because I've gotten this question a few times. Well, what about, this circumstance or this circumstance? Because obviously we know, like everything in nature, nothing is 100%. That there's always going to be variation in statistically, there's always going to be outliers in some way. This is absolutely true. So I want to show you this graph. So this first one, so we're on slide 34. So imagine we're looking at sex with the red and the green clusters. This is what we're talking about, that it is a binary. There are clearly two separate groups. There is going to be variation within females. There is going to be variation within males. So you might have the average females, let's say in the US is like 5'5". I'm 5'10". I'm definitely taller than the average female. And you're gonna have males who are probably shorter than the average male. You are, and there's gonna be variation in so many other things, like for females, let's say like hip width or breast size or any and every other feature. Uterus shape might be slightly, variant. For men, the same thing. There's going to be differences in, like I said, height or hair, facial hair growth, or every other little thing about us as humans, right? There's going to be variation. There's going to be variation in females. There's going to be variation in males in terms of like those phenotypic features that we see. But, and per this chart or this graph, you're going to see that there's still going to be two separate groups. There can be variation within those groups, hence that the clusters aren't like super tight. They're spread out a little bit because there's always going to be variation in things. But they are still clearly two separate and distinct groups from each other. That's the first point. The second point is if you look, you might see, and you can see this on this little chart, that there are, graph, I keep saying chart, doesn't matter. There are a handful of outliers, because we talked about this before, males and females, XY, XX, that there are some medical, why am I blanking on words today? Medical issues where, let's say you were born with like an extra X chromosome, for example. So that you'd be an outlier in that. You might be, born without ovaries, for example. You might be a little more of an outlier in the female group than the average, variation. So we're going to see the occasional outlier in a few things. Those outliers, as you can see right here in this picture, do not mean that those groups suddenly don't exist, that they don't make sense, that there isn't a binary. There absolutely is a binary, male, female. The occasional outlier does not disprove that. In fact, you probably have heard this expression before, like the exception proves the rule. I had to think for a second. The exception proves the rule. So this is true. This is what we're looking at. So we're going to see variation within females. We're going to see variation within males. We're even going to see the occasional outlier in a few different ways. You know, whether it's chromosomally or, you know, like phenotypically on that individual, we're going to see some occasional outliers, but those groups are still clearly two: sex, male, female. And of course, here's the second one. This is very different, and this is why it's important to understand the distinction between the two, that gender is not the same way. Because if we're looking from culture to culture, you know, population to population, whether even in the same country, if we're looking at like Las Vegas versus, you know, like where I'm from, Sacramento, we might have a different expectation. If we're looking at, you know, our country versus another country, the expectations are going to be different. If you're viewing, like I said, if you go back to slide 33 on that part about gender, is gender because academics would say it's both or either. Or is gender the expectations you feel that are on you, that are placed on you by the given society that you live in? Is it those expectations whether you're a male or a female? Or is it how you view yourself socially or culturally? And just going back to slide 34, you can see that, like, even if both of those are true, they are similar in that it's typically not, there's going to be some gradation to that a little bit. That if we're talking about this idea of like hyper masculine and hyper feminine, these extremes, or even like these cultural standards, I don't know if you guys can see my hands, I'm not sure if they were in the screen, you know, extreme masculinity or femininity, that we might say it doesn't matter which society we live in, we might say, like, this is the standard for males and this is the standard for females. Most people don't fall into that. Most people fall kind of somewhere, you know, in the range of, you know, maybe you're kind of right in the middle, maybe you feel like some of your traits are a little more masculine, a little more feminine, and it's going to depend too on like what does society even deem to be masculine or feminine. So like, for example, I'm a female, but, you know, if I were talking about the gendered expectations set on me and which ones I have accepted and which ones I have not, like, that's a whole other discussion, and it's a lot more nuanced. Oh, computer's about to die. Okay, plug it in. Okay. Like I said, it's a lot more nuanced, and every individual is going to be a little different. So it's definitely more of a spectrum in terms of, like, if you're looking at that, you know, hyper masculine to hyper feminine, and like I said, most people are going to fall somewhere, you know, in the middle range of that. Like, most people don't fit this very strict standard of super masculine or super feminine. Most people don't reach that, you know, as who they are as people. That's just not how it is. So like, you know, like I said, for example, like for myself, if being feminine is, you know, wearing dresses and makeup, well, I tend to do that. Sometimes, not all the time, but I definitely do that. But I also have dedicated a huge part of my life to higher education. And, you know, I like to be outdoors a lot. A few other things too. Like, so those might be considered, maybe not so much now in 2020, but definitely traditionally might have been considered more of a masculine trait. I definitely am very opinionated, which I would say, like, obviously is a trait that most people should have and should have that trait. But, you know, we could say, like, traditionally that might have been more of a masculine trait. Like, you probably hear this, like, you'd be more ladylike. And I think a lot of these, like, gendered expectations we see kind of falling away. Like, people are like, look, these expectations of how I'm supposed to behave, the things I'm supposed to like, the things I'm supposed to do, like, all of that's bullshit. You know, why can't we just be people and be able to like what we like? Like, I'm a girl, or I'm an adult woman, and I happen to like, going riding a motorcycle, or going fishing, or, you know, going camping, and that doesn't mean anything about who I am as, like, I'm still a female, you know, and I don't have to fit some cultural standard of being feminine. You know what I mean? And the same would go for any man, that a man could say, look, I enjoy watching romantic comedies. I learned how to sew. Like, who cares? You know, I'm a man, but I still like to do those things. Like, why does it matter? You know? So I think we're seeing this pushback a lot, that these, I think, gendered expectations that we feel like society has put on us Sometimes directly from family members, but also I think just like mass media, that I think we are starting to project a lot of that, which I would say is great. That there shouldn't be those expectations that are often, not always, but often can be harmful to us as individuals when we feel like we're put in a box of what we're allowed to do and not do just because of the body we're born into, So okay, that's just my thoughts on that. So those two things are not the same thing. Okay, slide 35. Oh, so I do have a list. So biological differences between males and females. So I already kind of said this, but if we're looking at the hormones, obviously the chromosomes, but those what we call secondary or primary and secondary sex characteristics. So primary would be like if you're looking at genitalia, you can obviously tell like male versus female. Obviously, as most of you know, as adults in the world, there's going to be variation in everything. If you're looking at just a variety of women, you're going to see that there's going to be variation. Like in genitalia, there's going to be variation in like hair type or length or color, labia. For males, you're going to see a difference in, penis size. But the variation exists, obviously, but we still can see those two groups. There's also going to be differences in per this slide, and we're looking at male, female, so internal reproductive organs as well. There's going to be that difference, and in general, we could say those who gestate versus those who inseminate. This would be true for if we're looking at mammals, that there are kind of two reproductive roles that we see happening that require very specific organs and different organs, both internally and externally. So we're going to see those differences between male and female, and then I have a picture right there of the pelvis we were talking about before with male versus female. So like I said, if we found, that bottom pelvis in the ground, we could say, okay, we have a female, but we wouldn't know anything else. We wouldn't be able to know how she viewed herself socially, what the expectations were put on her by society, positive or negative. We wouldn't know any of that. We would just be able to tell she was female. Okay, slide 36. Human sexuality. I feel like some of this, I enjoy so much having these conversations with you guys in person, and it feels, some of the other stuff I'm talking about in the lectures, I can just talk to the screen and it's fine. I'm like, blah, 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 this and that. These ones, I feel like it's built so much on the interactions with you guys, but we'll just see how this goes. Okay. So human sexuality, obviously you guys know what that is, right? So the sexual practices of humans, this is obviously depending on what culture or population you live in, there are going to be different things that are normalized or standardized or considered taboo or not taboo, depending. But also here we have some definitions, and most of you are probably familiar with at least 3 of those 4 terms. And usually in class, when I have this PowerPoint slide up, I ask the class, have you heard of this 4th one, pansexual? Usually in the last couple of years, I'd say it's split, 50-50. One half would say, I've heard of this term, I understand it, I know what it is. And some would say, I don't really know what that is, I've never heard it, or I've only vaguely heard it. So usually I'd have someone in the class, explain, what is your opinion on this, what is yours, in terms of definitions. But we have the definition there. And then usually I follow it up with the question of, is there a difference between pansexual and bisexual? And usually this is a great topic of discussion and debate in the class, which is always really interesting. And like I said, we don't get to have that, right now. But I will just kind of leave that open for you to think about in terms of what we've talked about before. And obviously from your personal opinion, would you say there's a difference, yes or no? In fact, you know what I'll do is, why don't we make it, I'm going to write this down so I don't forget. I lost my pen. Oh, there it is. Why don't we make this an extra credit? So if you are watching this right now, because I'm not going to post an announcement on it, I'm just going to let you guys see it right here. Oh, because as a side note, I'll look at the analytics from my YouTube videos and I'm like, oh, I have a 25-minute video and the average time that people watched it was 7 minutes. You guys are not watching them all the way through. That is totally up to you. I'm not going to monitor that. You might be getting some really great information from the first half of it, but you might be missing some important stuff like this. Okay, so I'm going to write this down so I don't forget. I'm going to give you guys an extra credit opportunity. Extra credit? You I will say up to 5 points extra credit. And send me an email in CSN email or in Canvas messaging, and just give me a paragraph, like 5 to 6 sentences, one paragraph on whether you think bisexuality and pansexuality are like very similar concepts or whether they're different concepts, and then just tell me why. And this can just be your opinion, or you can bring in some of the stuff that we've talked about in this class if that has informed on that opinion. I just want to know kind of your thoughts on this and get you guys thinking about it a little bit. And like I said, try to use what we've done in class. I'm just writing this down. Okay. You try to incorporate what we've talked about in class, but this doesn't need to be a big long essay. Like, give me a paragraph. Like, if you go a little longer, that's fine, but I don't want you guys to feel like you have to give me a new writing assignment. This is just extra credit. You do not have to do this extra credit. But I will give you up to 5 points. If you give me coherent sentences and you make a point, you tell me. Like I said, just tell me your kind of opinion, hopefully informed a little bit from what we've talked about in class. Is there a difference between bisexuality and pansexuality? Yes or no, and then the reason why. So, like I said, just to kind of get your thoughts on this, and we'll go from there. 5 points extra credit. One paragraph, 5 to 6 sentences. For those of you who did not watch, you're going to miss that extra credit opportunity. So we'll see how many. Watch, I get one person turning it in. Only one person watched this video till the end. Okay. I can already tell this is going to be a long one, because what are we at now? We're already at 40 minutes. Oh, shit, you guys, I'm so sorry. I totally rambled for forever. Okay. And I still have 20 slides left. Okay. Let's try to keep this under an hour. I try not to even have these go longer than 45 minutes. Okay. Okay. I'm sorry. Okay, so slide 37. The Kinsey Scale. So some of you might be aware of this or not, or might have heard of it before. Basically, early on, let's say 100 years ago, a little less than 100 years ago, probably in the 40s and 50s, researchers were looking at human sexuality. There were so many misconceptions about human sexuality and sexuality in general. Like I said before, in our society, a huge taboo. And I totally blanked. I was thinking about something. But, okay, this is what I was thinking about. So there's a movie on this, actually. There's a movie with Liam Neeson, and it's based on, he plays Kinsey in this movie. It's a pretty good movie. In fact, this would be one of the movies I would accept for extra credit, per the instructions in the extra credit on the syllabus, so you can just follow it. I think the movie's called Kinsey. I think that's what it's called. Anyway, so part of this was looking at understanding human sexuality is often, a little more complex than we give it credit for. That most people do not identify as exclusively heterosexual or exclusively homosexual. That a lot of people would find be a variant of that to some degree. Now, if we were in class, I would ask, if you feel comfortable, raise your hand. So just take a moment and look at this and be like, okay, where would I fall on this scale? With 0 to 6, with 0 being exclusively heterosexual, and 0 being exclusively heterosexual, and 6 being exclusively homosexual, and then of course 3 being perfectly 50-50 bisexual. Most people would kind of fall maybe at a 1 or a 5, or maybe we're gonna get some 0s and 6s or 3 like that. But we have a variety of people. I've never done this in class, and I don't have at least one person say they're one of those numbers. Usually it's this wide range for those who participate, because some people don't feel comfortable, and that's totally fine.